Lord Russell, what is philosophy?
Well, that's a very controversial question. I think no two philosophers will give you the same answer. My own view would be that philosophy consists of speculations about matters where exact knowledge is not yet possible. But that will only be my answer, not anybody else's.
What's the difference between philosophy and science?
Well, roughly you'd say science is what we know and philosophy is what we don't know. That's a simple definition. And for that reason, Christians are perpetually passing over from philosophy into science as knowledge advances.
When something is established and discovered, it ceases to be philosophy and becomes science.
Yes. And all sorts of questions that used to be labeled philosophy are no longer so labeled.
What good is philosophy?
I think philosophy has two uses, really. One of them is to keep alive speculation about things that are not yet amenable to scientific knowledge. After all, scientific knowledge covers a very small part of the things that interest mankind and ought to interest them. There are a great many things of immense interest about which science, at present at any rate, has nothing to say. And I don't want people's imaginations to be limited and enclosed within what can be now known. And I think to enlarge your imaginative purview of the world into the hypothetical realm is one of the uses of philosophy. But there's another use which I think is equally important, which is to show that there are things we thought we knew and don't know. On the one hand, to keep us thinking about things that we may come to know, and on the other hand, to keep us modestly aware of how much that seemed like knowledge isn't knowledge.
Could you give some illustrations of the sort of subject which have been speculated about and then produce some material result later?
Yes, it's quite easy to do so, especially from Greek philosophy. The Greeks invented a whole lot of hypotheses which turned out valuable later, but which in their day couldn't be tested. Take, for example, the atomic hypothesis. Democritus invented the atomic hypothesis that matter consists of little atoms. And after about 2,000 years, and rather more than that, it turned out that this was the right scientific view. But in his day, it was merely a suggestion.
But didn't Plato think that Democritus's theory about atoms was a lot of nonsense?
Plato was horrified by him, said all his books ought to be burnt, because Plato didn't like science. He liked mathematics, but he didn't like anything else that was scientific.
Now, in this way, philosophy, in a sense, becomes a kind of servant of science.
Well, that's part of it. But, of course, it isn't only a servant of science, because there are a number of things that science can't deal with. All questions of values, for example. Science won't tell you what is good and what is bad. Tell you what is good or bad as an end, and not just as a means.
But what change has there been over the years in the attitude of philosophers and the public to philosophy, would you say?
Well, that depends upon the school of philosophy that you're thinking of. In Plato and in Aristotle, in both of them, the main thing was an attempt to understand the world. And that, I should say personally, is what philosophy ought to be doing. But then you come on to the Stoics, and their emphasis was mainly on morality. That you ought to be stoical, you ought to endure misfortunes patiently. And that came to be the popular use of a philosopher.
Would you say that Marx was a philosopher?
Well, he was certainly in a sense a philosopher. But now there you have an important division among philosophers. There are some philosophers who exist to uphold the status quo. and others who exist to upset it, and Marx, of course, belongs to the second lot. For my part, I should reject both those as being not the true business of a philosopher. And I should say the business of a philosopher is not to change the world, but to understand it, which is the exact opposite of what Marx said.
What kind of a philosopher would you say you are?
Well, the only label I've of is logical atomist. I'm not very keen on the label. I've rather avoided labels.
What does that mean, a logical atomist?
It means, in my mind, that the way to get at the nature of any subject matter you're looking at is analysis, and that you can analyze until you get to things that can't be analyzed any further, and those would be logical atoms. I call them logical atoms because they're not little bits of matter. They're the, so to speak, ideas out of which a thing is built up.
What is the main trend of philosophy today?
Well, one would have to distinguish there between English-speaking countries and continental European countries. The trends are much more separate than they used to be, very much more. In English-speaking countries, and especially in England, there is a new philosophy which has arisen, I think, through the desire to find a separate field for philosophy. In what I was saying a moment ago, it would appear that philosophy is merely incomplete science, and there are people who don't like that view. They want to have science have a sphere, philosophy have a sphere to itself. That has led them into what you may call linguistic philosophy, that the important thing for the philosopher is not to answer questions, but to get the meaning of the questions quite clear. I can't myself agree to that view, but I could give an illustration. I was once bicycling to Winchester, and I lost my way, and I went to a village shop, and I said, can you tell me the shortest way to Winchester? And the man I asked called to a man in a back region whom I couldn't see. Gentleman wants to know the shortest way to Winchester. And the voice came back, Winchester? Aye. Way to Winchester? Aye. Shortest way? Aye. Don't know. And so I had to go on without getting an answer. Well, that is what Oxford philosophy thinks one should do.
We get the question right, never mind about the answer.
Yes, it's somebody else's business to give the answer.
How does this differ from the continental approach?
The continental approach is, well, it's more full-blooded. I don't agree with it anymore, but in a sense it's much more full-blooded and much more like philosophies of earlier times. There are various kinds. There's the philosophy that comes from Kierkegaard, existentialism, and then there are philosophies designed to provide apologetics for traditional religion. There are various things of that sort. I don't think myself that there's anything very important in all that.
What practical use is your sort of philosophy to a man who wants to know how to conduct himself?
A great many people write to me saying they are now completely puzzled as to how they ought to conduct themselves because they've ceased to accept the traditional signposts to right action and don't know what others to adopt. And I think that the sort of philosophy I believe in is useful in this way, that it enables people to act with vigor when they're not absolutely certain that that is the right action. I think nobody should be certain of anything. If you're certain, you're certainly wrong, because nothing deserves certainty. And so one ought always to hold all one's beliefs with a certain element of doubt, and one ought to be able to act vigorously in spite of the doubt. After all, this is what a general does when he's planning a battle. He doesn't quite know what the enemy will do, but if he's a good general, he guesses right. If he's a bad general, he guesses wrong. But one has, in practical life, to act upon probabilities. And what I should look to philosophy to do to encourage people to act with vigor, without complete certainty.
Yes, but now, how about this business, though, of making people so uncertain about things they'd sort of believed and had faith in? Doesn't that rather disturb them?
Well, it does for a time, of course. And I think a certain amount of disturbance is an essential part of mental training.
러셀은 저자 서문에 이렇게 쓰고 있습니다. 내가 이 책을 쓴 것은 이 이야기들이 사람들의 상식이 되었으면 좋겠다고 생각했기 때문이다. 내가 독자들에게 내놓은 비결은 직접 경험을 통해 확인한 것들이며 이 비결대로 행동할 때마다 나는 더욱 행복해졌다. 지난 세기 최고의 지성인 중에 한 사람인 러셀이 자신의 성공 경험을 바탕으로 쓴 행복의 정복은 행복해지고 싶은 사람이라면 누구든지 읽을 만한 가치가 있는 책입니다. 특별히 러셀은 수많은 젊은이들을 염두에 두고 이 책을 쓴 것 같습니다. 이 책은 전체 17개의 글로 이루어져 있습니다. 그리고 17개의 글은 크게 두 부분으로 구분되어 있습니다. 1부는 행복이 당신 곁을 떠난 이유이고 2부는 행복으로 가는 길입니다. 각각의 글은 서로 유기적으로 얽혀 있진 않습니다. 그러니까 심심할 때마다 하나씩 읽어도 좋고 제목을 보고 관심 있는 것부터 읽어도 좋습니다. 다시 말하지만 이 책은 행복론이 아닙니다. 러셀이 행복에 대한 자신의 철학을 논리적으로 구성한 책이 아니라 행복을 주제로 쓴 여러 개의 글을 한 책에 묶어낸 것입니다. 전체적으로 내용을 살펴보면 인간이 행복하지 않은 이유 혹은 행복할 수 있는 방법에 대해서 뚜렷한 명제가 될 만한 문장이 여기저기 흩어져 있습니다. 먼저 러셀은 자신이 삶을 즐기고 행복하게 된 비결은 자신에 대한 집착을 줄인 데 있다고 말합니다. 이러한 비결은 이 책 전반에 걸쳐서 나타난 전제입니다. 행복하려면 자신에 대한 관심을 줄이고 관심을 외부로 돌려야 한다는 것이죠. 그렇다고 자신을 완전히 잊을 정도로 망각하라는 말은 물론 아닙니다. 자신에 대한 지나친 관심을 멈춰야 한다는 말이죠. 또한 러셀은 고독의 철학을 반대합니다. 이 부분은 아마 지금 세대에도 필요한 말이라고 생각이 됩니다. 르네상스 이후로 확산되고 발전해온 개인주의는 행복의 영역에서도 확고한 자리를 차지하고 있는 것 같습니다. 고독해도 괜찮고 혼자여도 괜찮다는 생각이 사회에 만연해 있는데 러셀은 이런
One last question. Suppose, Lord Russell, this film were to be looked at by our descendants, like a Dead Sea Scroll in 1,000 years' time. What would you think it's worth telling that generation about the life you've lived and the lessons you've learned from it?
I should like to say two things, one intellectual and one moral. The intellectual thing I should want to say to them is this. When you are studying any matter or considering any philosophy, ask yourself only what are the facts and what is the truth that the facts bear out. Never let yourself be diverted either by what you would wish to believe or by what you think would have beneficent social effects if it were believed. But look only and solely at what are the facts. That is the intellectual thing that I should wish to say. The moral thing I should wish to say to them is very simple. I should say, love is wise, hatred is foolish. In this world, which is getting more and more closely interconnected, we have to learn to tolerate each other. We have to learn to put up with the fact that some people say things that we don't like. We can only live together in that way. But if we are to live together and not die together, we must learn a kind of charity and a kind of tolerance, which is absolutely vital to the continuation of human life on this planet. Three passions simple but overwhelmingly strong, have governed my life. The longing for love, the search for knowledge, and unbearable pity for the suffering of mankind. These passions, like great winds, have blown me hither and thither in a wayward course over a deep ocean of anguish, reaching to the very verge of despair. I have sought knowledge. I have wished to understand the hearts of men. I have wished to know why the stars shine. I have tried to apprehend the Pythagorean power by which number holds sway above the flux. A little of this, but not much, I have achieved. I got the sort of satisfaction that Plato says you can get out of mathematics. It was an eternal world, it was a timeless world. It was a world where there was a possibility of a certain kind of perfection. Love and knowledge, so far as they were possible, led upward toward the heavens. But always pity brought me back to earth. Echoes of cries of pain have reverberated in my heart. Children in famine, victims tortured by oppressors, helpless old people, a hated burden to their sons, and the whole world of loneliness, poverty, and pain make a mockery of what human life should be. I long to alleviate the evil, but I cannot, and I too suffer. I have sought love, first because it brings ecstasy. Ecstasy so great that I would often have sacrificed all the rest of life